What happens when a powerful Arab executive forces a vulnerable woman into signing a contract that changes everything? When Amira Kone, a brilliant African engineer, is cornered into accepting terms she never fully understood, she disappears for 7 years. But when she returns, the truth she carries will shake the very foundations of everything Rashid Al-Mansouri built. This is a story of power, deception, hidden truths, and the price of underestimating someone you've wronged. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The glass towers of Dubai's business district reflected the scorching afternoon sun as Amira Kone stepped out of the taxi, her worn leather portfolio clutched tightly against her chest. At 26, she possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that commanded respect in engineering circles, but today, desperation clouded her usually confident demeanor. Her father's medical bills had mounted beyond anything her family could handle, and this meeting represented her last hope. The Al-Mansouri Group headquarters stretched 40 floors into the cloudless sky, a monument to the wealth and influence of one of the Gulf's most powerful business empires. Amira had heard whispers about Rashid Al-Mansouri, the ruthless executive who had built his fortune through strategic acquisitions and an iron will that bent entire industries to his vision. What she hadn't expected was to find herself standing before his mahogany desk within the hour, facing a proposal that would change her life forever. Rashid Al-Mansouri sat behind his imposing desk like a king surveying his domain. At 38, he possessed the sharp features and calculating eyes that had intimidated countless business rivals into submission. His traditional white thobe was impeccably tailored, and the subtle scent of oud cologne filled the space between them. Everything about him spoke of absolute control, from the way he held his fountain pen to the measured cadence of his voice. "Miss Kone," he began, his English carrying the refined accent of someone educated at Oxford but rooted in the authority of old Arabian merchant families. "I've reviewed your credentials. MIT graduate, specialized in sustainable energy systems, top 5% of your class. Impressive for someone so young." Amira straightened in her chair, trying to project confidence despite the tremor in her hands. "Thank you, Mr. Al-Mansouri. I believe my expertise in renewable energy infrastructure could be valuable to your expansion into North Africa." A thin smile played at the corners of Rashid's mouth, but it never reached his eyes. "Indeed. However, your personal circumstances present complications." The words hit her like a physical blow. She knew he was referring to her father's mounting medical debt, the failed family business back in Senegal, and the visa issues that had left her stranded in Dubai with limited options. Her research had shown that Al-Mansouri made it his business to know everything about the people he dealt with, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like a violation. "I'm not sure I understand," she said carefully, though they both knew she understood perfectly. Rashid leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled as he studied her with the detached interest of a chess master positioning his pieces. "Your father's cancer treatment requires immediate funding. Your family's construction company in Dakar is 3 months behind on loan payments. Your work visa expires in 6 weeks, and given the current complications with your application, renewal seems unlikely." Each word was delivered with surgical precision, cutting away at her composure. Amira felt heat rise in her cheeks, a mixture of humiliation and anger that she fought to suppress. She had come here hoping to negotiate a consulting contract, perhaps a partnership that would utilize her expertise while providing the financial security her family desperately needed. Instead, she was being dissected like a specimen under a microscope. "I've done my research on you as well, Mr. Al-Mansouri," she said. her voice steadier than she felt. Your company is moving into sustainable energy because the oil markets are shifting. You need someone who understands both the technology and the African markets. That's why I'm here. For the first time, something flickered in Rashid's eyes. Surprise, perhaps even a hint of respect. Most people who sat in that chair either cowered or tried to flatter their way into his good graces. Amira was doing neither. You're correct, he acknowledged, which is why I'm prepared to offer you something far more comprehensive than a simple consulting agreement. He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a thick document bound in expensive leather. The contract landed on the desk between them with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the spacious office. This is a 5-year exclusive commitment, Rashid explained, his tone shifting to that of a man accustomed to dictating terms rather than negotiating them. You will oversee the development of our renewable energy initiatives across North and West Africa. Your base salary will be substantial, more than enough to cover your father's treatment and clear your family's debts within the first year. Amira reached for the contract, her heart racing. The numbers on the first page made her breath catch. It was more money than she had ever imagined earning. But as she flipped through the pages, her engineering mind began to process the fine print, and what she found made her stomach clench. This isn't just an employment contract, she said slowly, looking up to meet his gaze. This gives you complete control over where I live, who I work with, even who I can associate with outside of work. The commitment must be absolute, Rashid replied without hesitation. The projects you'll be working on involve proprietary technology and sensitive market intelligence. We cannot afford divided loyalties or information leaks. But this clause here, Amira pointed to a section buried deep in the legal language. It says, I cannot leave the company for any reason during the 5-year term, regardless of circumstances. And this one, it gives you the right to reassign me to any location within your business network without my consent. Rashid's expression remained impassive. The compensation reflects the exclusivity of the arrangement. This isn't employment, Amira said, her voice rising slightly. This is indentured servitude dressed up in legal language. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Rashid studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Miss Kone, let me be direct. Your expertise is valuable, but you are not irreplaceable. There are other engineers, other consultants who would sign this contract without hesitation. However, your particular combination of skills and cultural knowledge makes you the most efficient choice. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. The question is not whether this arrangement is fair by your standards. The question is whether you can afford to refuse it. The cruelty of the statement was breathtaking in its honesty. Amira felt the walls of the luxurious office closing in around her as the reality of her situation crystallized. Her father's medical team had been clear. Without immediate treatment, he had months, not years. Her family's business was on the edge of bankruptcy, and her own legal status in the UAE was precarious at best. I need time to consider this, she said, though they both knew she was buying time she didn't have. Of course, Rashid replied smoothly. You have until tomorrow at noon. After that, the offer expires, and I will pursue other options. As Amira stood to leave, clutching the contract that felt like both a lifeline and a noose, Rashid's voice stopped her at the door. Miss Kone, he said, his tone almost conversational, I want you to understand something. This arrangement will be beneficial for both of us, but it requires absolute trust. I don't make exceptions, and I don't renegotiate once terms are agreed upon. If you sign that contract, you become part of something larger than yourself, something that will demand everything you have to give. She turned back to face him, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. behind the polished exterior and refined manners was a man who viewed the world in terms of assets and liabilities, who saw people as resources to be acquired and managed. The realization should have sent her running, but the weight of her family's needs anchored her in place. "I understand," she said simply, though she was beginning to suspect that she understood very little about what she was truly being asked to sign. That evening, Amira sat in her small Dubai apartment, the contract spread across her kitchen table like a map to an unknown territory. She had read every clause, every subsection, every piece of fine print that the lawyers had buried in dense legal language. The more she studied it, the more she realized that Rashid Al-Mansouri wasn't just hiring her, he was purchasing her. In body and mind, for 5 years of her life, her phone buzzed with a message from her mother in Dakar. "The doctors say we need to make a decision about your father's treatment by tomorrow. The cost." The message trailed off, but Amira knew what the unfinished sentence meant. Without immediate financial intervention, they would have to choose between bankrupting the family or watching her father die. She thought about her engineering degree, the years of study and sacrifice that had brought her to this moment. She had dreamed of building sustainable infrastructure across Africa, of using her knowledge to lift communities out of poverty and environmental degradation. The irony wasn't lost on her that achieving those dreams might require sacrificing her own freedom to a man who saw her as nothing more than a valuable acquisition. As midnight approached, Amira made her decision. She would sign the contract, but she would also remember every detail of how Rashid Al-Mansouri had cornered her into this choice. Someday, she promised herself, there would be a reckoning for what he was taking from her. She didn't know how or when, but she would find a way to reclaim not just her freedom, but her dignity. The next morning, she walked back into the Al-Mansouri building, her signature ready to seal a bargain that would change both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 months after signing the contract, Amira Kone found herself living in a reality that defied every expectation she'd had about her new life. The luxury apartment Rashid had provided in downtown Dubai was stunning, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Burj Khalifa, marble floors that gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and furnishings that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Yet every beautiful detail felt like another bar in an elaborate cage. The Al-Mansouri group had wasted no time putting her to work. Within weeks of signing, she had been thrust into meetings with government officials from Morocco, Nigeria, and Ghana, discussing multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects that would reshape the energy landscape across Africa. Her expertise was being utilized exactly as promised, but the conditions under which she operated grew more restrictive with each passing day. "Your travel documents," said Khalil Hassan, Rashid's personal assistant, as he placed a manila envelope on her desk. Inside, Amira found her passport, but it had been modified. The Al-Mansouri Group's corporate seal was now affixed to every page, and a note from the UAE immigration authorities confirmed that any international travel required pre-approval from her employer. "This wasn't in the contract," Amira said, looking up at Khalil with barely concealed frustration. The middle-aged man adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his expression apologetic but firm. "Mr. Al-Mansouri's instructions were very clear. Given the sensitive nature of your work, all travel must be coordinated through proper channels. It's for security purposes." Security. The word had become a catch-all explanation for the increasingly tight control over her movements. Her company-issued phone monitored her communications. Her apartment building required special access codes that logged every entry and exit. Even Her meals were being provided by a catering service that reported directly to Al-Mansouri management. That evening, Amira stood on her apartment balcony, watching the Dubai fountain show in the distance. The water danced to classical music, creating patterns of light and motion that should have been beautiful. Instead, she felt like she was watching her freedom perform its own elaborate death dance. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. "Your father's treatment is going well. The doctors are amazed by his progress. We can never thank you enough for what you've sacrificed for our family." The irony cut deep. Her sacrifice was saving her father's life, while slowly suffocating her own. She had become a highly paid prisoner, her brilliant mind put to work generating profits for a man who saw her as nothing more than a valuable asset to be managed and controlled. The next morning brought a summons to Rashid's office that would change everything she thought she understood about her situation. When she arrived, she found him reviewing architectural plans spread across a conference table that could seat 20 people. The blueprints showed a massive complex of buildings, solar panels and wind turbines stretching across what appeared to be hundreds of acres. "The Sahara Solar Initiative," Rashid announced without looking up from the plans. "Your first major project as head of African Renewable Development. $5 billion in investment, partnerships with 6 governments, and the potential to empower half of West Africa within a decade." Despite everything, Amira felt her pulse quicken. This was the kind of project she had dreamed about since graduate school, the opportunity to bring clean energy to millions of people who had never had reliable electricity. Her engineering mind immediately began processing the technical challenges and solutions, the logistics of construction across multiple countries, the coordination required to make such an ambitious vision reality. "The scope is incredible," she admitted, studying the detailed schematics, "but the political complexities alone would take years to navigate. The regulatory frameworks in these countries are completely different, and the infrastructure requirements, which is why you'll be relocating to oversee the project personally," Rashid interrupted, finally looking up to meet her gaze. "Effective immediately." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Relocating where?" "We've established a field headquarters in Ouarzazate, Morocco. You'll be based there for the next 18 months, minimum. Everything has been arranged: housing, security, local staff. You leave on Friday." Amira felt the room tilt slightly. "Friday was 3 days away. I wasn't consulted about this. I have commitments here, my apartment, Your contract specifies that you can be reassigned to any location within our operational network," Rashid said, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child. "Morocco is well within that scope, but I have no say in this decision, no input into where I live or work." For the first time since she'd known him, Rashid's composed mask slipped slightly, revealing something that might have been impatience, or perhaps even annoyance. "Miss Kone, you seem to be laboring under a fundamental misunderstanding. This is not a collaborative partnership. You are an employee, a very well-compensated employee, but an employee nonetheless. The terms of your engagement are not subject to negotiation or modification based on your personal preferences." The brutally honest statement crystallized everything Amira had been feeling, but hadn't quite been able to articulate. She wasn't a valued team member or a trusted consultant. She was property, intellectual property that had been purchased and was now being deployed where it would generate the maximum return on investment. "What if I refuse?" she asked quietly. Rashid's expression hardened, and for a moment she glimpsed the steel beneath his polished exterior. "Then you would be in breach of contract. The penalties for such a breach are clearly outlined in the agreement you signed. Financial penalties that would not only require you to return every dollar we've paid you, but additional damages that would bankrupt your family permanently. legal action that would ensure you never work in engineering again anywhere in the world. The threat was delivered with surgical precision, each word calculated to remind her exactly how trapped she was. Amira thought about her father, whose cancer treatment was only possible because of the money flowing from this arrangement. She thought about her mother, who had called last week to say she was sleeping peacefully for the first time in months, because their financial worries were over. "I understand," she said, though the words felt like swallowing broken glass. "Excellent," Rashid replied, his demeanor immediately shifting back to business-like efficiency. "Khalil will handle all the relocation details. You'll have a full support staff in Morocco, and I'll be conducting regular site visits to monitor progress." As Amira left his office, contract and blueprints in hand, she felt something fundamental shift inside her. The last vestiges of the hopeful young engineer who had walked into this building 3 months ago finally died, replaced by something harder and more calculating. If Rashid Al-Mansouri wanted to treat her like a chess piece, then she would learn to play chess. That night, she began making plans of her own. The flight to Morocco was Amira's first time leaving Dubai since signing the contract, but even 30,000 feet above the Mediterranean, she felt the invisible chains that bound her to Al-Mansouri's empire. The private jet was luxurious beyond anything she had ever experienced, but the 2 security guards who accompanied her made it clear that this was transportation, not freedom. Ouarzazate sprawled beneath the Atlas Mountains like a city caught between 2 worlds, ancient kasbahs and traditional markets existing alongside modern hotels and industrial complexes. The Al-Mansouri compound, where she would live and work, sat on the outskirts of the city, a fortress-like collection of buildings surrounded by high walls and sophisticated security systems. Her new living quarters were spacious and well-appointed, but the windows were reinforced and the communication systems were clearly monitored. Every comfort had been provided, except the one thing she valued most, the ability to leave when she chose. Dr. Youssef Ben Ali, the Moroccan engineer who would serve as her deputy, greeted her with a mixture of professional respect and barely concealed pity. Over their first working dinner, his meaning became clear. "You are not the first foreign expert Al-Mansouri has brought here," he said carefully, his English accented with French undertones. "There have been others, geologists, architects, energy specialists. They arrive with great fanfare and ambitious projects, but they rarely stay long enough to see their work completed." "What happens to them?" Amira asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Youssef's expression grew somber. "They discover that working for Al-Mansouri is not the same as working with him. Eventually, they find ways to break their contracts, usually at great personal cost, or they simply disappear from the projects, reassigned to other locations, other initiatives." "Has anyone ever completed a full contract term?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Over the following weeks, Amira threw herself into the solar project with an intensity that surprised even her. If she was going to be trapped here, she would at least ensure that her work meant something. The Sahara Solar Initiative had the potential to transform millions of lives, bringing electricity to villages that had never seen electric light, powering hospitals and schools and communication networks that could connect isolated communities to the larger world. But the more she learned about the project's true scope, the more she began to understand that her imprisonment was just one small part of a much larger game. The contracts with African governments weren't just about energy, they were about control. The infrastructure Al-Mansouri was building would create dependencies that would last for generations, giving his company unprecedented influence over the political and economic development of an entire continent. She was helping to build an empire, And her brilliant mind was the tool being used to ensure that empire's foundations were unshakable. Late one evening, as she reviewed supply chain documents in her temporary office, Amira made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about her situation. Buried in the financial projections was a line item that made her blood run cold. Asset liquidation. Technical personnel. Year 3-5. The language was corporate and sterile, but the implications were terrifying. Al-Mansouri wasn't planning to honor her 5-year contract. He was planning to dispose of her, legally, financially, or perhaps physically, once the major infrastructure was in place, and her specialized knowledge was no longer essential. She was not just a prisoner. She was a temporary asset with a predetermined expiration date. That night, Amira began planning not just her escape, but her revenge. If Rashid Al-Mansouri thought he could use her and discard her, he was about to learn that he had severely underestimated the woman he had trapped in his golden cage. 6 months into her exile in Morocco, Amira had become a different person entirely. The naive engineer who had once believed in the power of good intentions and hard work had been replaced by someone far more dangerous. A woman who understood that survival required deception, patience, and the careful cultivation of allies. In the most unexpected places, the Sahara Solar Initiative was proceeding ahead of schedule, a fact that brought regular visits from Rashid Al-Mansouri. Each time he arrived at the compound, Amira played her role perfectly, the dedicated employee, focused solely on technical excellence. But behind her professional facade, she was building something else entirely, a network of information, influence, and leverage that would eventually become her weapon against the man who had imprisoned her. It began with Hassan Qureshi, the compound's head of security. A former Pakistani military officer with intelligent eyes and a quiet demeanor, Hassan had initially been another obstacle in her path. But during late nights, working on security protocols for the solar installations, Amira began to notice something troubling in his behavior, a careful distance he maintained from certain communications, a reluctance to fully engage with directives that came directly from Dubai. "You've worked for Al-Mansouri for 3 years, Amira said one evening as they reviewed perimeter security footage together. That's longer than most people last in his organization. Hassan's fingers paused over the keyboard, his expression carefully neutral. Mr. Al-Mansouri values loyalty and results. I provide both. And what happens to people who provide results but lose their usefulness? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them wanted to acknowledge directly. Hassan turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw past his professional mask to the man beneath, someone who had seen too much and understood exactly how expendable they all were. "Miss Kone," he said quietly, "there are some conversations that should never take place within these walls." The following week, Hassan found reasons to drive Amira into Ouarzazate for equipment inspections and meetings with local contractors. During these trips, always carefully planned to avoid surveillance, they began to talk. What she learned changed everything she thought she knew about Al-Mansouri's operations. The Syrian architect who designed the water purification systems, Hassan explained as they sat in a small cafe in the old Medina. Brilliant man, responsible for innovations that could have provided clean water to millions. He completed his project 2 years ago and was supposed to return to Damascus. What happened to him? Hassan's expression darkened. Car accident. Very convenient timing, just days before he was scheduled to present his work at an international conference. The presentation was given by Al-Mansouri representatives instead, and all patents were transferred to the company. Amira felt ice form in her stomach, and the geologist from Nigeria, Heart attack at 34. No previous medical history. Died in his sleep the night before he was supposed to give testimony to a UN committee about mineral rights violations. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was more horrifying than anything she had imagined. Al-Mansouri wasn't just exploiting brilliant minds. He was systematically eliminating them once their knowledge had been extracted and their usefulness had ended. "How many others?" she asked. "7 that I know of personally. Probably more that were handled by other security teams." That night, alone in her guarded quarters, Amira made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She wouldn't just escape, she would destroy Rashid Al-Mansouri's entire operation. But to do that, she needed evidence, allies, and most importantly, she needed him to believe she was still under his control. The next phase of her plan required accessing information that existed only in Al-Mansouri's most secure systems. Fortunately, her role as project director gave her legitimate reasons to request technical data, financial records, and communication logs. What wasn't legitimate was how she began copying and storing that information using methods her MIT computer science courses had taught her, but she'd never expected to use for espionage. Dr. Fatima Al-Zahra, the Moroccan renewable energy specialist, who served as liaison with the government agencies, became Amira's second, unlikely ally. Initially, Fatima had been suspicious of the foreign expert who had been imposed on their national infrastructure project, but as they worked together, she began to see the same troubling patterns that had alarmed Hassan. "The contract terms with our government," Fatima confided during a site inspection of the solar panel installations. "They're not what we were told they would be. The energy pricing agreements, the maintenance requirements, the technology transfer clauses, everything favors Al-Mansouri to an extent that borders on colonial exploitation." Amira wasn't surprised. "What did your ministry officials say when you raised these concerns?" Fatima's laugh was bitter. "The officials who negotiated the original terms have been remarkably silent. 2 of them received very lucrative consulting positions with Al-Mansouri subsidiaries. The third one, well, he died in a climbing accident in the Atlas Mountains last month. The scope of the corruption was staggering, but it also represented an opportunity. If Amira could document the systematic bribery, intimidation, and elimination of obstacles to Al-Mansouri's expansion, she would have the kind of evidence that could bring down not just one man, but an entire network of complicity and exploitation. Her breakthrough came through an unexpected source, Rashid himself. During one of his inspection visits, he made an error that would prove fatal to his carefully constructed empire. Confident in his control over Amira and trusting in the security measures that had protected him for years, he allowed her to sit in on a video conference with his Dubai headquarters. The meeting was supposed to be routine, a progress report on the Morocco project and planning for the next phase of African expansion. But what Amira heard during that conference confirmed her worst fears and provided her with the final pieces of information she needed to bring him down. "The technical specialist has exceeded expectations," Rashid told his executive team, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man discussing a successful investment. "The project timeline has been accelerated by 8 months, and the efficiency improvements she's implemented will increase profitability by 40%. "What's the timeline for asset transition?" asked a voice from Dubai that Amira recognized. "As Khalil Hassan, Rashid's assistant, 18 months maximum," Rashid replied without hesitation. "Once the primary infrastructure is operational and the government contracts are locked in, we'll initiate the standard protocol. The knowledge transfer documentation is already being prepared. Asset transition, standard protocol, knowledge transfer." The euphemisms were chilling in their clinical detachment, but their meaning was unmistakable. In 18 months, Amira would join the growing list of brilliant minds who had outlived their usefulness to Rashid Al-Mansouri. "And the replacement technical team?" another voice asked. "Already being recruited. 3 candidates from different backgrounds, Egyptian, South African, and Algerian. We'll select the most suitable once the current asset is no longer viable." The casual discussion of her planned elimination, conducted as if she were a piece of equipment rather than a human being, filled Amira with a cold fury that clarified her thinking like nothing else could. She maintained her professional expression throughout the remainder of the meeting, taking notes on technical specifications and nodding at appropriate moments. But inside, her mind was racing through the final details of a plan that had been months in the making. That evening, as Rashid prepared to return to Dubai, he summoned Amira to his temporary office. She found him reviewing financial projections, his satisfaction evident in every gesture. "Exceptional work," he said without looking up from his documents. "The efficiency improvements you've implemented will serve as the template for our expansion into Kenya and Tanzania. Your expertise is proving even more valuable than I initially calculated." "Thank you," Amira replied, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. "I believe in the project's potential to transform lives across the continent." For the first time, Rashid looked directly at her, and she saw something in his expression that might have been genuine approval. "You've adapted to your circumstances remarkably well. Many people in your position struggle with the parameters of their engagement, but you've focused on the work itself, which demonstrates wisdom." The condescending praise made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to smile. "I've learned that fighting against reality is less productive than finding ways to excel within whatever constraints exist." "Precisely," Rashid nodded, clearly pleased with what he interpreted as her complete submission to his authority. "That attitude will serve you well in your future assignments." Future assignments, as if there would be any future beyond the 18 months he had just allocated for her usefulness. After he left for Dubai, Amira began the most dangerous phase of her plan. Using access codes she had memorized during the video conference, she began systematically downloading files from Al-Mansouri's secure servers. Financial records that documented years of bribery and corruption. Communication logs that revealed the systematic intimidation of government officials. Medical records and accident reports that established the pattern of convenient deaths that had eliminated witnesses and rivals. Most damning of all were the asset management files that contained detailed plans for the elimination of technical specialists once their projects were completed. The Syrian architect, the Nigerian geologist, the Egyptian water systems engineer, all of their deaths had been meticulously planned and executed as routine business operations. But the files also revealed something else that changed the entire scope of her mission. Al-Mansouri's network extended far beyond what she had imagined, incorporating government officials, international development agencies, and multinational corporations in a web of corruption that spanned 3 continents. The evidence she was gathering wouldn't just destroy one man, it would expose a systematic exploitation scheme that had been operating for over a decade. As she compiled the evidence, Amira realized that her own imprisonment had been part of something much larger than revenge or profit. She had been positioned at the center of Al-Mansouri's most ambitious project specifically because her expertise was essential to creating the infrastructure that would establish his permanent control over Africa's energy sector. But knowledge was power, and Amira now possessed knowledge that could destroy everything Rashid Al-Mansouri had built. The question was no longer whether she could escape, it was whether she could survive long enough to use what she had learned to bring him down. The countdown to her own elimination had begun, but she was no longer the helpless victim who had signed that contract 2 years ago. She was a weapon, carefully forged by the very man who planned to destroy her, and she was almost ready to strike. 2 years into her contract, Amira had perfected the art of appearing completely broken while secretly assembling the pieces of Al-Mansouri's destruction. The Sahara Solar Initiative was nearing completion, its massive arrays of panels stretching across the Moroccan desert like a technological monument to human ambition. To any observer, she was the brilliant engineer who had exceeded every expectation, transforming from a desperate young woman into Al-Mansouri's most valuable asset. But Rashid Al-Mansouri was beginning to suspect that his prized possession might not be as thoroughly controlled as he had believed. The first sign of trouble came through an encrypted message that Hassan intercepted from Dubai headquarters. During their weekly security briefing, his usual composed demeanor cracked just enough for Amira to notice the tension. "There's been a development," he said quietly as they reviewed patrol schedules in his office. "Intelligence suggests that someone has been accessing classified files from the Dubai servers. The digital forensics team is conducting a full audit of all remote access points." Amira's blood turned to ice, but she maintained her professional expression. "Do they know who?" "Not yet, but they're implementing new security protocols that will make any future access impossible. More concerning for you specifically, they're planning to conduct individual security assessments of all technical personnel." The implications were clear. Al-Mansouri's paranoia was finally catching up with her careful espionage. If his security team discovered her activities, the 18-month timeline for her elimination would accelerate dramatically. "When?" she asked. "The assessment team arrives next week. 7 days. After 2 years of patient planning and evidence gathering, she had 7 days to either complete her mission or watch everything unravel. That night, Amira made a decision that would forever alter the course of both their lives. Instead of trying to hide her activities or accelerate her escape, she would do something Al-Mansouri would never expect. She would force his hand by making herself too valuable to eliminate, while simultaneously making him too vulnerable to ignore her demands. Her plan required Dr. Fatima's help, and when she explained what she needed, the Moroccan engineer's eyes widened with a mixture of admiration and terror. "You want to sabotage the entire solar grid? Amira, that represents billions of dollars in infrastructure and years of work. The economic impact alone won't be permanent," Amira assured her. "I'm not going to destroy it. I'm going to create a dependency that only I can manage. A backdoor in the control systems that will require my constant oversight to prevent catastrophic failures." "But why? If you're planning to escape anyway." "Because I'm not planning to escape anymore," Amira said, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised even her. "I'm planning to take control." Over the next 3 days, working in the deepest hours of the night, when security patrols were lightest, Amira implemented code modifications across the solar grid's control systems. The changes were subtle, buried deep in diagnostic subroutines and maintenance protocols, where they would be invisible to standard security scans. But together, they created a network of dependencies that made her personal oversight essential to the system's continued operation. More importantly, she embedded a series of triggers that would activate if her biometric authentication was ever removed from the system or if she failed to input weekly authorization codes. The triggers wouldn't destroy the solar grid, but they would create cascading failures that would require months to diagnose and repair, if anyone could even figure out what had been done. The security assessment team arrived on Thursday, led by a cold-eyed Israeli specialist named David Roth, who had built his reputation on extracting information from people who thought they had nothing to hide. Amira had expected this moment for months, and she was ready. The interrogation took place in a sterile conference room, with Roth seated across from her, while recording equipment captured every word and micro-expression. For 3 hours, He probed. Her activities, her communications, her access to sensitive systems. Amira answered every question with the perfect blend of professional competence and personal resignation. "Your work has been exceptional," Roth acknowledged near the end of the session. "But exceptional employees sometimes develop complex relationships with their responsibilities. Have you ever felt that your knowledge of these systems gives you leverage over the organization? It was a trap designed to elicit either a defensive response or an admission of unauthorized activities." Amira chose a third option. "Mr. Roth," she said, with the weary tone of someone who had long since accepted her fate, "I signed a contract that made me Al-Mansouri property for 5 years. Whatever leverage I might theoretically possess is meaningless compared to the leverage he holds over my family, my future, and my life. I'm an engineer, not a revolutionary." Her performance was flawless, and Roth concluded his assessment with a recommendation that she be cleared for continued access to sensitive systems. But Amira knew that Al-Mansouri's suspicions wouldn't be satisfied by a single security review. She was right. The following week brought an unexpected visitor, Rashid himself, arriving unannounced with a team of technical specialists who began conducting what he called a comprehensive system audit. "Routine maintenance," he explained to Amira as they watched technicians crawling through server rooms and control centers. "The solar grid represents our largest single investment. We need to ensure that every component is operating at optimal efficiency." But Amira recognized the audit for what it really was, a hunt for evidence of sabotage or unauthorized access. As the technicians worked, she maintained her composure while mentally reviewing every modification she had made, every line of code she had altered. She had been careful, but careful might not be enough if they knew what to look for. The breakthrough that would define everything came on the third day of the audit. One of the technicians discovered anomalies in the system logs, not evidence of Amira's modifications, but something far more damaging to Al-Mansouri's operations. "Sir," the technician called out, his voice tight with concern, "you need to see this." What he had found were traces of external intrusion attempts, sophisticated attacks on the solar grid's control systems that had been ongoing for months. The attacks weren't coming from within the compound or even from Morocco. They were originating from servers in Tel Aviv, Beijing, and Washington, D.C. Industrial espionage, Rashid said grimly as he reviewed the evidence. "Competitors trying to steal our technological innovations." But Amira recognized something in the attack patterns that the others had missed. The intrusion attempts weren't random. They were following the exact same pathways she had used to access Al-Mansouri's classified files. Someone else had discovered her activities and was using her methods to conduct their own investigation. Realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't the only one hunting Al-Mansouri. Someone with significant resources and sophisticated technical capabilities was conducting their own investigation into his operations. The question was whether they were potential allies or competitors who would eliminate her as a threat to their own plans. That evening, as Rashid prepared to return to Dubai with his technical team, he summoned Amira to his temporary office. She found him standing at the window, looking out at the solar arrays that stretched to the horizon, the monument to her brilliance and her imprisonment. "The security audit revealed some troubling vulnerabilities," he said without turning around, "external threats that require immediate countermeasures." "What kind of countermeasures?" Amira asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Enhanced security protocols, restricted access to critical systems, and most importantly, a new oversight structure that will ensure our most valuable assets are properly protected." He turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression that made her blood run cold. It wasn't suspicion or anger. It was the calculated look of a man who had made a decision that would be final and irrevocable. "You'll be pleased to know that your exceptional performance has earned you a promotion," he continued. "Effective immediately, you're being transferred to our new research facility in Abu Dhabi. The work there will require your complete focus and dedication." Amira's mind raced through the implications. Abu Dhabi meant deeper isolation, tighter security, and closer supervision. It meant the end of her carefully cultivated network of allies and the beginning of what would essentially be solitary confinement, with technical responsibilities. "I appreciate the opportunity," she said carefully, "but the Morocco project still requires significant oversight. The maintenance protocols alone will be handled by a new technical team," Rashid interrupted. "Smoothly. Your innovations have been thoroughly documented, and we've recruited specialists who can manage the day-to-day operations. Your talents are needed for more advanced challenges." The dismissal was absolute, but it also revealed a fatal flaw in Al-Mansouri's understanding of what he had created. He believed that her innovations could be replicated, that her knowledge could be transferred to others, like data copied from one hard drive to another. He had no idea that she had made herself indispensable in ways that no documentation could. "Capture. When do I leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning. Everything has been arranged." That night, Amira activated the final phase of her plan. Using communication protocols that Hassan had helped her establish, she sent encrypted messages to contacts in international law enforcement agencies, human rights organizations, and investigative journalists. The messages contained not just the evidence she had gathered about Al-Mansouri's crimes, but detailed information about the systematic vulnerabilities she had embedded in his technological infrastructure. But her masterstroke was a message sent directly to Al-Mansouri's Dubai headquarters, timed to arrive 12 hours after her scheduled departure for Abu Dhabi. The message contained a simple proposition: a meeting to discuss the terms of a new arrangement between them, one based not on her servitude, but on her indispensability. By the time Rashid Al-Mansouri read that message, he would discover that his most controlled asset had become his most dangerous adversary. And for the first time in his life, he would find himself in a position where someone else held all the cards. The hunter had become the hunted, and the game was about to change completely. The private jet carrying Amira to Abu Dhabi never reached its destination. 3 hours into the flight, as they crossed over the Arabian Peninsula, the pilot received new coordinates and an urgent message from Al-Mansouri headquarters. "Return to Dubai immediately." Amira sat in the leather seat, watching the landscape shift below, knowing that her message had reached its target and triggered exactly the response she had anticipated. Rashid Al-Mansouri was waiting in his office when she arrived, but the man who greeted her was not the composed executive who had always maintained absolute control over every situation. His usually pristine appearance showed signs of strain. His tie slightly loosened, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it, and his eyes carrying the wild look of someone whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. "Sit, or down," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. Amira took her time, settling into the chair across from his desk, noting the additional security personnel positioned around the room, and the way Rashid's hands trembled slightly, as he gripped a tablet displaying what she recognized as her encrypted message. "You want to explain this?" he asked, sliding the tablet across the desk. Amira glanced at the screen, though she knew every word by heart. "The Sahara Solar Initiative contains critical vulnerabilities that require my personal oversight. Any attempt to transfer, reassign, or eliminate me will result in cascading system failures, affecting 4 countries and 17 million people. We need to discuss new terms." "New terms," Rashid repeated, his voice dripping with incredulity. "You think you can threaten me? You think your little computer tricks give you leverage against everything I've built? I think you should check the status of your Morocco operations, Amira replied calmly. Rashid's eyes narrowed, but he made a gesture to one of his assistants, who immediately began placing calls to the Ouarzazate facility. The conversation that followed was tense and urgent, conducted in rapid Arabic that Amira understood better than Rashid realized. When the assistant hung up, his face was pale. The grid is experiencing random fluctuations, he reported. Nothing catastrophic yet, but the engineers can't identify the source. They're recommending immediate system shutdown until a full diagnostic can be performed. A full diagnostic that will take approximately 6 months, Amira added helpfully. Assuming your team can eventually identify and correct modifications embedded in approximately 40,000 lines of code across 17 different control systems. The silence that followed was deafening. Rashid stared at her with a mixture of rage and something that might have been respect. For the first time in their relationship, she held cards he couldn't simply take away. You sabotaged my infrastructure, he said slowly. I created dependencies, Amira corrected. Dependencies that ensure the continued successful operation of your most valuable asset. The solar grid will function perfectly as long as I'm alive, free, and motivated to maintain it. Any change in my status will result in problems that your other engineers won't be able to solve. And if I call your bluff? If I'm willing to accept the financial losses to teach you a lesson about crossing me? Amira smiled for the first time since entering his office. Then you'll explain to the Moroccan government why their national energy infrastructure failed, costing them billions in lost productivity and industrial contracts. You'll explain to your investors why your flagship project became a technological disaster, and you'll explain to your other business partners why they should trust you with their critical infrastructure when you couldn't protect your own. But more than that, she continued, you'll have to explain why 17 million people lost access to electricity because you decided to eliminate the one person who could prevent it. Rashid leaned back in his chair, his calculating mind working through the implications. Amira could see him weighing options, considering alternatives, looking for any angle that would restore his control over the situation. What do you want? He asked finally. Complete freedom of movement and association, full control over the Morocco project and all related technological development, a new contract that recognizes me as a partner rather than property, and immediate cessation of your asset elimination protocols. You're asking me to abandon the entire structure that makes my organization effective. I'm asking you to evolve beyond a business model that depends on murdering brilliant people once they've outlived their usefulness. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Rashid's mask slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation that had always lurked beneath his polished exterior. You have no proof of any such activities, he said carefully. Actually, I do. Amira reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. Financial records showing payments to the individuals who arranged the convenient deaths of 7 technical specialists, communication logs detailing the planning of those eliminations, medical examiner reports that were mysteriously altered after initial findings raised questions about cause of death. She placed the folder on his desk, noting how his eyes fixed on it with the intensity of a predator recognizing a mortal threat. Insurance, she explained. Copies of these documents are currently in the possession of Interpol, the International Criminal Court, and investigative journalists at 3 major international newspapers. If anything happens to me, anything at all, they'll be released simultaneously. You're bluffing, Rashid said, but his voice lacked conviction. Test me, Amira replied. See what happens. For several minutes, they sat in silence. 2 brilliant, minds locked in a battle of wills that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of an empire built on exploitation and murder. Finally, Rashid spoke. "Even if I agreed to your terms, you must understand that this makes you a permanent enemy. There will never be peace between us. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering when I'll find a way to destroy you." "Perhaps," Amira acknowledged, "but I'd rather spend my life as your enemy than die as your victim." The negotiation that followed lasted 14 hours, conducted with the intensity and precision of two chess masters playing for the highest possible stakes. Rashid brought in lawyers, security specialists, and technical experts, all trying to find weaknesses in Amira's position or alternatives to her demands. But she had spent 2 years preparing for this moment, and every challenge they raised had been anticipated and countered. By dawn, they had reached an agreement that transformed their relationship completely. Amira would maintain control of the Morocco project and serve as Chief Technical Officer for all Al-Mansouri renewable energy initiatives across Africa. She would have a seat on the company's board of directors and veto power over any decisions affecting technical personnel. Most importantly, the asset elimination protocols would be permanently discontinued. In exchange, she would stabilize the solar grid and provide Al-Mansouri with the technological innovations that would cement his dominance in the renewable energy sector. It was a devil's bargain that made her complicit in his broader schemes, but it also gave her the platform to protect future victims and gradually reform the organization from within. But the most significant change was something neither of them explicitly acknowledged. They were now equals. The power dynamic that had defined their relationship from the beginning had been completely inverted. Rashid still controlled vast wealth and influence, but Amira controlled the technology that made that wealth possible. As she prepared to leave his office, Rashid made one final attempt to assert dominance. "You realize that by forcing this arrangement, you've made yourself as much a prisoner as you ever were," he said. "You'll never be able to leave, never be able to trust anyone, never be able to live a normal life. You've traded a cage for a throne, but it's still a cage." Amira paused at the door, considering his words. "Perhaps," she said finally. "But now it's a cage I chose, with terms I negotiated, protecting people I care about. That's not freedom, but it's something close to justice." 3 months later, Amira stood on the observation deck of the completed Sahara Solar Initiative, watching the sun set over an ocean of solar panels that stretched to the horizon. The facility was generating enough clean energy to power 4 countries, providing electricity to millions of people who had never had reliable access to power before. Hassan joined her on the deck, no longer her guard, but her chief of security, leading a team dedicated to protecting the facility and its personnel from the kind of threats that had eliminated their predecessors. "Any regrets?" he asked, looking out at the technological marvel they had helped create. Amira considered the question carefully. She thought about the young engineer who had walked into Al-Mansouri's office 3 years ago, desperate and naive, believing that good intentions and hard work were enough to change the world. That woman was gone, replaced by someone harder but infinitely more effective. "No regrets," she said finally, "but no illusions either. This is just the beginning." Far below them, the control systems that governed the massive solar installation hummed with electronic precision, their operations dependent on protocols that only Amira fully understood. She had built herself into the very foundation of Al-Mansouri's empire, making herself simultaneously indispensable and untouchable. It wasn't the freedom she had once dreamed of, but it was something more valuable, the power to shape the future on her own terms. And with that power came the responsibility to ensure that no one else would ever be trapped the way she had been. The war between them was far from over. But the battlefield had changed completely. And for the first time since signing that contract, Amira felt like she had a chance of winning. 5 years had passed since Amira's confrontation with Rashid transformed their relationship from captor and prisoner to reluctant partners in building a renewable energy empire across Africa. The Al-Mansouri Group's clean energy division, now under her technical leadership, had become the most influential force in African infrastructure development, powering cities from Lagos to Cairo with technology that bore her innovations. But power, Amira had learned, was a double-edged weapon that could cut both ways. The first sign that their uneasy partnership was beginning to fracture came through an encrypted message from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a brilliant Spanish engineer who had been recruited to lead Al-Mansouri's European expansion. The message was brief but chilling. "They're doing it again. New protocols. Need to meet." Amira arranged the meeting through channels that even Hassan's security network couldn't trace. Using contacts she had cultivated among international human rights organizations during her years of gathering evidence against Al-Mansouri's original elimination protocols. Elena's story, told in hushed tones in a safe house in Geneva, confirmed Amira's worst fears. "The European renewable projects are staffed entirely by short-term specialists," Elena explained, her hands shaking as she showed Amira personnel files on her encrypted tablet. "Brilliant people, each one supposedly essential to their specific projects. But the contracts are different now, more sophisticated, harder to challenge legally." The new contracts, Elena revealed, contained clauses that allowed for emergency reassignment of personnel to undisclosed locations for security reasons. More ominously, they included medical consent forms that permitted the company to make healthcare decisions for employees who became incapacitated during their service. "It's the same pattern," Elena continued, "but evolved. Instead of eliminating people after their projects are complete, they're creating legal frameworks to make people disappear during their contracts. The families receive substantial compensation, packages, and non-disclosure agreements that prevent them from asking questions." Amira studied the documents, her engineering mind automatically analyzing the systematic nature of the new approach. Rashid had learned from their confrontation, adapting his methods to account for the vulnerabilities she had exposed. He couldn't eliminate her. Their mutual dependencies made that impossible. But he could perfect his techniques on others, while their partnership provided him with protective cover. "How many?" Amira asked quietly. 12 that I know of in the past 18 months. All of them working on projects that are now being managed by Al-Mansouri executives with no technical background." The scope of the continued exploitation hit Amira like a physical blow. While she had been focused on building her own power base and protecting herself, Rashid had been refining his methods and expanding his operations. Her victory had been Pyrrhic. She had saved herself, but failed to stop the systematic destruction of brilliant minds that continued around her. That night, alone in her Geneva hotel room, Amira confronted a truth she had been avoiding for years. Her partnership with Al-Mansouri had not reformed his organization. It had legitimized it. Her presence on the board of directors, her technical innovations, her public profile as a successful African engineer in a major multinational corporation, all of it provided cover for continued atrocities. She had become complicit in the very system she had fought to escape. The realization demanded action, but the constraints of her position made any direct challenge virtually impossible. Her access to sensitive information was monitored, her communications were filtered through company systems, and most critically, her continued control over the Morocco solar grid remained the only thing preventing Al-Mansouri from eliminating her entirely. But Amira had not survived 5 years of corporate warfare. By accepting impossible situations, if she couldn't challenge Rashid directly, she would do something far more dangerous. She would outmaneuver him strategically. The plan she developed over the following months required her to play a role that went against every instinct she had developed since their first confrontation. She would appear to embrace their partnership completely, becoming not just a reluctant ally, but an enthusiastic advocate for Al-Mansouri's expansion plans. Only by gaining his complete trust could she position herself to strike at the heart of his operations. Her first move was to propose a massive new initiative, the African Continental Energy Network, a project that would link renewable energy systems across 30 countries in a grid capable of powering the entire continent. The technical challenges were staggering, the political complexities enormous, and the potential profits astronomical. It was exactly the kind of visionary project that would appeal to Rashid's ego, while requiring the kind of technical expertise that only she could provide. The scope is unprecedented, she explained during a board meeting in Dubai, her presentation, displaying satellite images and engineering schematics that painted a picture of technological ambition on a scale never before attempted. We're talking about fundamentally transforming how an entire continent generates and distributes energy. The financial returns would be measured in decades, but the strategic control would be permanent. Rashid listened intently, his sharp mind immediately grasping the implications. Control over Africa's energy infrastructure would give Al-Mansouri influence over every government, every major industry, every aspect of economic development across the continent. It was the ultimate expression of the power he had always sought. The technical requirements, he said carefully, would presumably require expanding our specialist personnel significantly. Absolutely, Amira agreed. We'd need to recruit the best minds from around the world, electrical engineers, systems architects, materials scientists, political liaisons, hundreds of the most brilliant people in their respective fields. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the recognition that such a project would require exactly the kind of technical specialists he had been systematically eliminating for years. But she could also see his hunger for the power that success would bring. The recruitment process would need to be carefully managed, he said finally. We can't afford security leaks or divided loyalties in a project of this magnitude. Of course, Amira replied smoothly. I've already begun developing protocols that would ensure absolute commitment from all personnel involved. Over the following weeks, Amira threw herself into developing the Continental Energy Network proposal with an enthusiasm that surprised even her closest allies. Hassan, who had become her most trusted advisor, expressed concern about the direction of her strategy. You're giving him exactly what he wants, he warned during one of their secure conversations. A legitimate reason to recruit and control hundreds of additional technical specialists. How does this help the people Elena told you about? Because, Amira explained, I'm not actually building his network, I'm building mine. The recruitment protocols she developed for the Continental Energy Network were indeed designed to ensure absolute commitment, but not to Al-Mansouri. Embedded within the standard contract language and technical requirements were coded messages and contact information that would allow recruited specialists to communicate with a network of protection and advocacy organizations that Amira had been secretly developing for years. More importantly, the technical specifications for the energy network included vulnerabilities that would make the entire system dependent on a core group of engineers who were loyal to Amira rather than Al-Mansouri. If he tried to eliminate any of the recruited specialists, the entire continental grid would become unstable. But Rashid was not the naive businessman who had underestimated her years earlier. As the project moved forward, he began implementing his own safeguards, including surveillance protocols, that monitored all recruited personnel and security measures that prevented unauthorized communication between team members. The cat-and-mouse game that developed over the project's first year was a masterclass in corporate espionage and counter-espionage. Amira used her position as technical director to embed protection measures for the recruited specialists, while Rashid used his control over security and administration to identify and eliminate threats to his authority. The breaking point came when Dr. James Okonkwo, a Nigerian electrical engineer who had been recruited for the project, disappeared during what was supposed to be a routine site inspection in Chad. His family received a generous compensation package and a death certificate citing equipment failure and accidental electrocution, but Elena's investigation revealed inconsistencies that suggested a more sinister explanation. Amira knew that challenging the official explanation would reveal her ongoing investigation into Al-Mansouri's activities and potentially destroy the protection network she had been building. But allowing the death to pass without consequence would signal to Rashid that she had accepted the continuation of his elimination protocols. Standing in her Dubai office, looking out at the city lights that represented both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human exploitation, Amira made a decision that would define the final phase of their conflict. She would stop playing defense and start playing offense. The message she sent to Rashid's private communication system was brief and unmistakable. Dr. Okonkwo's death was not an accident. We need to discuss the future of our partnership. Tomorrow noon, your office. Come alone. For the first time in 5 years, Amira was preparing to go to war against the man who had created her. But this time, she wasn't fighting for her own freedom. She was fighting for the lives of every brilliant mind that Al-Mansouri would consume in his pursuit of absolute power. The hunter and the hunted were about to face each other in a final confrontation that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of technological innovation across an entire continent. Tomorrow, one of them would emerge victorious, and the other would face the consequences of a game played for the highest possible stakes. The morning of their confrontation, Rashid Al-Mansouri stood in his office preparing for what he knew would be the most consequential meeting of his life. 7 years had passed since a desperate young engineer had signed a contract that was supposed to make her his property. Instead, she had become his greatest threat, his most valuable asset, and now, potentially, his destroyer. He reviewed the files spread across his mahogany desk, security reports, financial projections, and most ominously, a detailed analysis of every system vulnerability that Amira had embedded in his technological empire. His team of specialists had finally cracked the scope of her sabotage, revealing a network of dependencies and backdoors that made her elimination virtually impossible without destroying everything he had built. But Rashid had not survived in the brutal world of international business by accepting impossible situations. If Amira thought her technological leverage made her untouchable, she was about to discover that he had spent the past 5 years developing leverage of his own. When Amira entered his office precisely at noon, Rashid noted the subtle changes in her demeanor. Gone was any pretense of deference or collaboration. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. But he also noticed something else, a tension around her eyes that suggested she was not as certain of victory as she appeared. "You wanted to discuss Dr. Okonkwo," he said without preamble, gesturing for her to sit. "I wanted to discuss the fact that you're still murdering people despite our agreement," Amira replied, remaining standing. James had a wife and 3 children. He was building water purification systems that could have served millions of people. And you had him killed because his innovations threatened your control over the technology. Rashid leaned back in his chair, studying her with the detached interest he had always shown when analyzing a business problem. Dr. Okonkwo died in an industrial accident. These things happen in large-scale construction projects. Industrial accidents don't leave traces of potassium chloride in the bloodstream, Amira said quietly. Industrial accidents don't require forged medical examiner reports, and industrial accidents don't coincidentally happen to people who've developed technologies that make your existing patents obsolete. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Rashid had known, of course, that Amira's intelligence network had grown sophisticated over the years, but the depth of her investigative capabilities was more extensive than he had realized. Even if I accepted your accusations, he said carefully, what exactly do you propose to do about it? You've made yourself indispensable to my operations, but that same indispensability makes any direct action against me mutually destructive. Actually, Amira said, reaching into her briefcase and withdrawing a tablet, I found a way to break that mutual dependency. She placed the device on his desk, and Rashid found himself looking at technical schematics that made his blood run cold. The diagrams showed a complete redesign of the Continental Energy Network's core systems, a redesign that eliminated every single vulnerability and dependency that had given Amira control over his infrastructure. Quantum-encrypted control systems, she explained, with the satisfaction of someone revealing a masterful chess move. Distributed processing that makes any single point of failure impossible, and most importantly, automated maintenance protocols that require no human oversight once they're implemented. Rashid stared at the schematics, his mind racing through the implications. If these systems were real, if they actually worked, then Amira could eliminate her own leverage while simultaneously destroying his ability to control the massive technological infrastructure they had built together. You're bluffing, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The prototype has been running for 6 months, Amira replied, hidden within the Morocco facility, disguised as a routine efficiency upgrade. The system has processed over 10 million gigawatt-hours of energy, distribution without a single human intervention. It works, Rashid, and I can implement it across your entire network within 90 days. Why? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Why would you eliminate your own protection? Because protection built on mutual assured. Destruction isn't protection, it's just delayed execution. You've proven that you'll never stop killing people as long as you have the power to do so. So I'm going to take that power away from you. Rashid stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Dubai skyline that represented everything he had built through decades of calculated ruthlessness. The city below was a monument to the kind of absolute control he had always sought, but it was also a reminder of how quickly empires could fall when their foundations were undermined. You realize, he said without turning around, that implementing this system would make you as vulnerable as anyone else. Once you lose your technological leverage, I'll have no reason to honor our agreement. I know, Amira replied simply. But I've also realized that living under the protection of mutual blackmail isn't living at all. It's just a more comfortable form of imprisonment. Rashid turned back to face her, and for the first time in years, she saw something in his expression that might have been genuine emotion, not anger or calculation, but something closer to respect. You're willing to sacrifice yourself to stop me, he said. That's either the most noble gesture I've ever witnessed, or the most elaborate suicide I've ever seen. Maybe both, Amira acknowledged. But before you start planning my funeral, there's something else you should know. She activated another screen on her tablet, and Rashid found himself looking at a live video feed from what appeared to be a conference room filled with people he recognized. Government officials from 12 African countries, representatives, From the International Criminal Court, executives from competing renewable energy companies, and investigative journalists from major international news organizations. "They're all waiting for my signal," Amira explained. "If I don't check in within the next hour, they'll receive complete documentation of your elimination protocols, financial records proving the systematic bribery of government officials, and most importantly, the technical specifications for the quantum encrypted systems that will allow them to seize control of your entire African infrastructure." Rashid felt the carefully constructed walls of his empire beginning to crumble around him. The scope of her preparation was breathtaking. She hadn't just planned her own liberation, she had orchestrated the complete destruction of everything he had built. "You're talking about economic warfare on a continental scale," he said quietly. "The disruption alone would affect hundreds of millions of people." "The disruption of dismantling your empire would be temporary," Amira replied. "The damage of allowing you to continue would be permanent. How many more brilliant minds are you planning to eliminate, Rashid? How many more innovations will you steal before destroying their creators?" The conversation that followed was unlike anything that had passed between them before. For the first time in their 7-year relationship, they spoke not as predator and prey, or even as reluctant partners, but as two brilliant minds engaged in a philosophical battle over the fundamental nature of power and responsibility. Rashid argued for the necessity of absolute control in managing complex technological systems, the inevitability of casualties in any large-scale transformation, and the dangerous naivety of expecting moral purity in geopolitical competition. Amira countered. With the inherent value of human life and creativity, the possibility of building systems that enhanced rather than exploited human potential, and the ultimate self-defeating nature of empires built on fear and murder. But beneath the philosophical debate was a more practical negotiation. Rashid was searching for any alternative that would preserve his power while satisfying Amira's demands for justice. Amira was offering him a choice between graceful transformation and total destruction. "There is one possibility," Rashid said finally, his voice carrying the tone of a man who had found an unexpected path through an impossible maze. "A restructuring that could satisfy both our objectives." He outlined a proposal that was as audacious as it was unprecedented. The complete transformation of Al-Mansouri Group from a traditional corporation into something closer to a technological foundation. Decision-making power would be distributed among councils of technical specialists, government representatives, and community leaders. Profits would be reinvested in infrastructure and education rather than concentrated in private accounts. Most importantly, the systematic elimination of personnel would be replaced by lifetime employment guarantees and profit-sharing arrangements that made every specialist a permanent stakeholder in the organization's success. "You're proposing to give up control of your own empire," Amira said, studying the detailed restructuring plan he had presented. "I'm proposing to evolve it into something more sustainable," Rashid replied. "Empires built on fear eventually collapse when people stop being afraid, but organizations built on mutual benefit can last for centuries." It was, Amira realized, the most sophisticated manipulation Rashid had ever attempted. By framing his surrender as evolution, by presenting the destruction of his absolute power as a strategic transformation, he was trying to maintain influence even as he appeared to capitulate completely. But it was also, potentially, a genuine path toward the kind of justice she had been seeking. If the restructuring was real, if the protections for technical personnel were enforceable, if the community oversight mechanisms had actual power, then it might be possible to transform his empire of exploitation into something that actually served the people it claimed to help. The devil is in the implementation, she said finally. Always, Rashid agreed. But devils, I've learned, can sometimes be reformed into something more useful. As they began working through the details of what would become the most complex corporate restructuring in African history, both of them understood that they were writing the final chapter of a relationship that had begun with coercion and evolved into something neither had expected. The question that remained was whether that final chapter would end in redemption or destruction, and whether the difference between those outcomes would matter to the millions of people whose lives hung in the balance. 7 years later, the auditorium at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa was packed beyond capacity with delegates from 54 nations, international media, and technology leaders from around the world, gathered for what had been billed as the most significant announcement in the history of renewable energy development. At the podium stood Dr. Amira Kone, now Director General of the Continental Energy Cooperative, preparing to reveal a truth that had taken 14 years to fully understand. The woman who stepped up to the microphone bore little resemblance to the desperate young engineer who had once signed a contract she barely understood. Her hair was streaked with premature silver. Her face carried the lines of someone who had fought battles that aged the soul, and her eyes held the depth that came from understanding both the best and worst of human nature. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak on behalf of an entire continent. "I stand before you today to reveal the truth about the Continental Energy Cooperative, about the man who co-founded it with me, and about the journey that transformed both an empire of exploitation and the woman who helped build it." In the audience, scattered among the delegates and journalists, sat the key figures who had shaped the extraordinary story she was about to tell. Hassan Qureshi, now head of the cooperative's Ethics and Security Council, watched from the diplomatic section. Dr. Elena Vasquez, leading the European Integration Project, sat with the technical advisory panel. Dr. Fatima Al-Zahra, who had become Morocco's Minister of Renewable Energy, represented the North African bloc, and in a private box reserved for special guests, Rashid Al-Mansouri listened with the intense focus of a man hearing his own transformation described by the person who had forced it upon him. 14 years ago, Amira continued, I was a young engineer facing an impossible choice. My father was dying, my family was drowning in debt, and I was offered a contract that promised to solve all my problems in exchange for 5 years of my life. What I didn't understand then was that I wasn't just signing an employment agreement. I was entering into a relationship that would challenge everything I believed about power, justice, and the possibility of redemption. She clicked a remote, and the massive screen behind her displayed a map of Africa illuminated with thousands of points of light, each one representing a renewable energy installation that now provided clean electricity to over 800 million people. Across the continent, the Continental Energy Cooperative now operates the largest integrated renewable energy network in human history, she announced to spontaneous applause. But the story of how we built this network is not the inspiring tale of technological innovation and international cooperation that most people believe. It's a darker, more complex story about how systems of exploitation can be transformed from within, and how the most unlikely partnerships can emerge from the deepest conflicts. Over the next hour, Amira laid out the complete truth of her relationship with Rashid Al-Mansouri. She spoke candidly about the forced contract, the systematic elimination of technical specialists, her own imprisonment and gradual accumulation of power, and the final confrontation that had led to the most comprehensive corporate restructuring in African history. The audience listened in stunned silence as she described the murders that had been disguised as accidents, the technological sabotage she had used to protect herself, and the evidence of corruption that had stretched across 3 continents. But she also spoke about the unexpected transformation that had occurred when 2 brilliant minds chose evolution over mutual destruction. The restructuring of Al-Mansouri Group into the Continental Energy Cooperative was not a fairy tale ending, she explained. It was a pragmatic recognition that sustainable power, both technological and institutional, requires the consent and participation of the people it serves. Rashid Al-Mansouri understood that his empire, built on fear and elimination, was ultimately unsustainable. I understood that my desire for justice had to be balanced against the needs of hundreds of millions of people who depended on the infrastructure we had built together. She clicked to another slide showing organizational charts that illustrated the cooperative's unique structure, technical councils with veto power over operational decisions, community oversight boards with authority over local installations, and profit-sharing mechanisms that made every employee a stakeholder in the organization's long-term success. But perhaps the most important innovation was the establishment of the Memorial Protocol, Amira said, her voice carrying a note of solemnity that quieted the large room completely. Every person who died as a result of the original Al-Mansouri elimination protocols is commemorated not just with a memorial, but with a scholarship fund that supports young engineers from their home countries. Their deaths were not forgotten or forgiven. They were transformed into a foundation for ensuring that future generations of brilliant minds could contribute to human progress without fear of exploitation. In his private box, Rashid Al-Mansouri felt the weight of those deaths in a way he had spent years learning to accept. The transformation of his organization had required him to confront not just the practical inefficiencies of his elimination protocols, but the moral horror of what he had systematically done to brilliant people who had trusted him. The man who had once viewed human beings as disposable assets had learned, through years of working alongside Amira and the oversight councils, to see them as irreplaceable sources of innovation and wisdom. It had been the most difficult education of his life, but also the most necessary. The current success of the Continental Energy Cooperative, Amira continued, represents more than technological achievement. It represents the possibility that systems built on exploitation can be transformed into systems that genuinely serve human flourishing. But that transformation requires constant vigilance, absolute transparency, and the willingness to hold power accountable to the people it affects. She paused, looking out at the audience that included government officials who had benefited from Al-Mansouri's bribes, business leaders who had competed with his organization, and activists who had spent years trying to expose his crimes. Which brings me to the announcement that has gathered you all here today, she said. After 7 years of leading the Continental Energy Cooperative, I am stepping down from my position as Director General. The organization we have built together is now mature enough, transparent enough, and democratically accountable enough to function without the concentrated leadership that was necessary during its transformation period. The announcement sent ripples of surprise through the audience. Amira Kone had become synonymous with the cooperative's success, and her departure represented a fundamental shift in how the organization would operate. My successor will be chosen not by a board of directors or a single appointment authority, but by a continent-wide election involving every employee, every community partner, and every stakeholder in the cooperative's operations. For the first time in the history of large-scale technological infrastructure, the people who are served by the system will choose who leads it. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Amira raised her hand for silence. But before I conclude, there is one more truth that needs to be spoken, she said, her gaze finding Rashid in his private box. The man who originally forced me into that contract, who built an empire on exploitation and murder, has spent the past 7 years working alongside me to dismantle everything he once believed about power and control. Rashid Al-Mansouri is not a reform villain in a story with a tidy morale. He is a complex human being who chose to confront the consequences of his actions and dedicate the remainder of his life to making amends. She clicked to a final slide, showing a photograph of a small village in Chad, where solar panels powered a medical clinic that served 50,000 people across a region that had never had reliable electricity. The clinic in this photograph was built with technology developed by Dr. James Okonkwo, the Nigerian engineer whose death was the catalyst for our final confrontation. His innovations, which were stolen after his murder, have now been released into the public domain and are being used to bring clean energy and modern medical care to some of the most remote communities on Earth. His death was transformed into a foundation for life. As Amira concluded her remarks and stepped away from the podium, the audience rose in a sustained ovation that reflected not just appreciation for her technical achievements, but recognition of the extraordinary human journey she had described. Later, that evening, at a private reception for cooperative leadership, Amira found herself standing on a balcony overlooking Addis Ababa, with the man who had once owned her contract and now served as the cooperative's Director of Ethical Compliance, a position that required him to investigate and prevent exactly the kinds of abuses he had once perpetrated. "Do you ever wonder," Rashid asked, looking out at the city lights powered by their renewable energy network, "what would have happened if you had refused to sign that original contract?" Amira considered the question carefully. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "My father might have died, my family would have lost everything, and you would have continued building your empire of exploitation until someone else found a way to stop you. And hundreds of brilliant people might still be alive," Rashid said quietly. "Maybe," Amira agreed, "but hundreds of millions of people might still be living without electricity, without clean water, without the infrastructure that's transforming their communities. The calculus of history is never simple." They stood in comfortable silence, two people who had learned that redemption was not a destination, but a daily choice to do better than the day before. "What will you do now?" Rashid asked. Amira smiled, and for the first time in 14 years, the expression was entirely free of calculation or guardedness. "I'm going to go home to Senegal and teach engineering at the university. I'm going to work with young people who have the same dreams I once had, and I'm going to make sure they never have to make the choices I made. And if someone like me tries to exploit them, then they'll be ready," Amira replied with quiet confidence. "Because the most important thing I learned from our relationship is that the best defense against exploitation is not just individual strength, but collective power. The young engineers I teach will never face their challenges alone." As the evening drew to a close, Amira reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from a desperate young woman signing a contract she didn't understand to a leader who had helped transform an entire continent's relationship with technology and power. The truth she had returned with was not a simple story of good triumphing over evil, but something more complex and ultimately more hopeful. The recognition that even the most damaged systems could be transformed, that even the most unlikely people could choose redemption, and that the arc of progress, however long and difficult, could bend toward justice when people had the courage to bend it. The contract that had once bound her in servitude had become the foundation for the most democratic technological organization in human history. The man who had once seen her as property had become her partner in building a system that treated every person as invaluable. And the young engineer who had once believed she had no power had learned that true power came not from control over others, but from the ability to create systems that empowered everyone to reach their full potential. It was not the ending she had expected when she first walked into Rashid Al-Mansouri's office, but it was the ending that the world needed. And sometimes, Amira had learned, that was enough. 5 years after the revelation, the University of Dakar's engineering building hummed with the energy of minds at work. In the corner office that had once belonged to her father before his illness, Professor Amira Kone reviewed thesis proposals from students whose names would have been impossible to pronounce when she first walked into Rashid Al-Mansouri's office. 19 years earlier, Fatou Diallo, a brilliant young woman from Mali, was designing microgrid systems that could bring electricity to nomadic communities. Omar Ben Ali from Morocco was developing solar panel technology that could function efficiently in sandstorm conditions. Sarah Nyong from Cameroon was creating water purification systems powered entirely by renewable energy. Each proposal represented not just technical innovation, but a fundamental shift in how young African engineers approached their work. They weren't seeking individual glory or external validation. They were solving problems for their own communities, building technology that would serve their own people. Professor Kone? Fatou stood in the doorway, her expression mixing excitement with nervous energy. I received a response to my grant application. Amira looked up from the paper she was grading, noting the way her students' hands trembled slightly. The James Okonkwo Memorial Fellowship was one of the most prestigious engineering grants in Africa, and competition was fierce among students who demonstrated both technical excellence and commitment to community service. And? Amira prompted, though she suspected she already knew the answer. I got it, Fatou whispered, then broke into a smile that could have powered the entire university. Full funding for 3 years, plus research support and mentorship from practitioners across the continent. Amira stood and embraced her student, remembering another young engineer who had once dreamed of changing the world through technology. The difference was that Fatou would never have to choose between her dreams and her family's survival, never have to sign contracts that made her property rather than partner. Dr. Okonkwo would be proud, Amira said softly. Your work honors his memory and continues his mission. As Fatou left to celebrate with her classmates, Amira returned to her desk and opened her secure communication channel. The message waiting for her was from Hassan Qureshi, now serving as director of the Global Technology Ethics Institute that had grown out of their original protection network. Amira, Hassan's message read, we've received reports of contract violations at 3 different renewable energy projects in Southeast Asia. The patterns are familiar, brilliant specialists being recruited under suspicious terms, families being pressured through financial leverage, and concerning clauses about emergency reassignments. We need your expertise to investigate. Amira sighed, recognizing that the work she had thought was finished would never truly be complete. The transformation of Al-Mansouri's empire had ended one particular system of exploitation, but human nature remained constant. There would always be powerful people seeking to control and exploit brilliant minds, and there would always be desperate people vulnerable to their manipulations. She composed her response quickly. Send me the details. I'll assemble a team, and we'll leave next week. The team she assembled for these investigations was unlike any corporate consulting group that had ever existed. Dr. Elena Vasquez brought her expertise in identifying hidden contractual vulnerabilities. Dr. Fatima Al-Zahra contributed her knowledge of governmental oversight mechanisms. Hassan provided security and intelligence capabilities. And Amira coordinated their efforts with the analytical skills that had once made her Al-Mansouri's most valuable asset. But perhaps the most important member of their team was the one who surprised everyone, Rashid Al-Mansouri himself. The man who had once perfected the art of exploiting brilliant minds, had become their most effective weapon against similar exploitation. His intimate knowledge of manipulation techniques, combined with his genuine commitment to prevention, made him uniquely qualified to identify and disrupt emerging patterns of abuse. It takes a particular kind of mind to build these systems, he had explained during one of their first joint investigations, the same kind of mind that's most capable of dismantling them. Their work together had evolved into something neither had expected, a partnership based not on mutual blackmail or forced cooperation, but on shared understanding of what was at stake when brilliant people were reduced to disposable assets. The Southeast Asia investigation took them to 3 countries over 2 months, uncovering a network of technology companies that were using variations of Al-Mansouri's old methods to recruit and control specialists in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and quantum computing. The scope was smaller than his original empire, but the techniques were more sophisticated, incorporating advances in surveillance technology and psychological manipulation that made resistance even more difficult. "They've learned from your mistakes," Amira told Rashid, as they reviewed evidence of forged medical documents and fabricated family emergencies being used to pressure scientists into signing exploitative contracts. "And we've learned from my mistakes, too," he replied grimly. "We know what to look for, how to document it, and most importantly, how to give their victims the leverage they need to fight back." The intervention they orchestrated was a masterclass in applied ethics and strategic planning. Rather than simply exposing the company's activities, they worked with affected specialists to build evidence, develop protection protocols, and create alternative support networks that eliminated the desperate circumstances that made exploitation possible. Dr. Li Wei, a Chinese quantum computing specialist who had been trapped in a 5-year contract that prohibited him from leaving Singapore, became the focal point of their rescue operation. Working with local authorities and international oversight bodies, they documented the systematic violation of his contract terms and the falsification of documents that had prevented his departure. More importantly, they provided him with the technological expertise to disable the quantum systems he had built, creating the same kind of leverage that had once protected Amira from elimination. When confronted with the choice between losing their most valuable specialist and reforming their employment practices, the company chose reform. "It's not justice," Li Wei said during their final meeting in Singapore. "The people who did this to me will face minimal consequences, and they'll probably find new ways to exploit other people." "No," Amira agreed. "It's not justice, but it's protection for you and prevention for others. Sometimes that has to be enough." The flight back to Dakar gave Amira time to reflect on how her life had evolved since that desperate day when she signed Rashid's contract. She had achieved everything she once thought she wanted: financial security for her family, professional recognition, the power to protect others from the exploitation she had experienced. But the cost had been higher than she had expected. The young woman who had dreamed of building sustainable infrastructure to lift communities out of poverty had been replaced by someone harder, more calculating, more aware of the darkness that existed within human systems. "Do you ever regret it?" Rashid asked as they flew over the Sahara, looking down at the solar installations that stretched across the desert like a technological constellation. "Which part?" Amira replied. "Signing your contract, fighting back, transforming your empire, spending my life hunting people like you used to be? Any of it, all of it." Amira considered the question seriously. Below them, the solar arrays powered cities and villages across North Africa, providing clean energy to millions of people who had once lived in darkness. In her briefcase were applications from students who would use their educations to solve problems that affected their own communities. In her secure communications were messages from specialists around the world who had been protected from exploitation because of the systems she had helped create. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that brilliant people had to die before we learned how to protect them. I regret that you had to become a monster before you could choose to become something better, but I don't regret the outcome. Even though you'll never have a normal life, even though you'll always be hunting or being hunted by the next version of what I used to be." Amira smiled, and for the first time in years, the expression was entirely peaceful. "Rashid, I stopped wanting a normal life the day I realized that normal life for most people includes accepting that brilliant minds will be exploited by powerful systems. I chose something different, something harder, but also something more meaningful." As their plane touched down in Dakar, Amira looked forward to returning to her students, to the next generation of engineers who would inherit the world she had helped reshape. They would face their own challenges, their own choices, between individual success and collective responsibility. But they would face them with better tools, stronger protections, and most importantly, the knowledge that they were not alone. The contract that had once made her property had become the foundation for ensuring that no one else would ever be forced to make the choices she had made. It was not the ending she had imagined when her journey began, but it was the ending that the world needed. And sometimes, Amira had learned, that was the most anyone could hope for. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.